Economies have faced a difficult time in the past several years, from the COVID-19 pandemic and the fight to recover from that to the impact of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. The prevailing global economic headwinds have left a deep mark. Due to declining foreign demand, soaring inflation, and tightening global financial conditions, Sub-Saharan Africa's growth in particular slowed to 3.4% in 2022. Millions more people in the region now face food insecurity and poverty as a result of drastic cost of living rises brought on by soaring food and energy costs, which are partially the result of the conflict in Ukraine. In many of Sub-Saharan Africa's economies, the dynamics of debt have become significantly worse due to rising borrowing costs and dim economic prospects. The region's growth could be further slowed by more pronounced weakness in its major economies, further rises in global interest rates, persistently high inflation, fragility, and an increase in the frequency and severity of unfavorable weather events, which would exacerbate poverty and put some countries in debt distress. Dr. Andrew Nevin, Chief Economist for PwC West Africa, joins me now live from Abuja, Nigeria. Andrew, welcome to Business Edge again. Happy New Year, and it's good to see your face.
Happy New Year. It's always great to be with you.
Thank you. So let's start with this. Throughout much of the latter parts of 2022, the outlook for the global economy in 2023 has been particularly dire. We've heard the word stagflation as well as the dreaded word recession. So given how economically fragile the world seems right about now, let's start with a look at that. How likely do you think a global recession is right now? We're seeing World Bank put it around 70% in terms of the potential for a recession this year. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I don't like to make predictions, especially about the future. We don't do forecasting at PwC Nigeria, but I mean, I'm in the camp that says we're going to have a difficult economic time. I mean, just to go back a little historically, back in 2008, we had the great financial crisis, and we had the reaction of advanced economies, quantitative easing, zero interest rate policies, and we never really dealt with the structural issues that led to the financial crisis. We, in a sense, kind of did an extended pretend. And now we've come 15 years later, almost 15 years later, and we still haven't dealt with it. And in the interim, we've had COVID and the crisis or the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine. So I think the world is in for a very difficult time. If I have to take a specific advanced economy, I think Britain, for those who follow, of course, there's many people here with ties to Britain or British citizens watching today. Britain's going through a very difficult time. But in my view, it's easy to blame Ukraine, easy to blame COVID, but in reality, it's having not dealt with structural issues over a long period of time.
So let's domesticate the conversation now. We've seen that there's a lot of pressure basically on the performance of Nigeria, Egypt, and South Africa as the largest economies on the continent. And it's almost like where they go, the rest of the continent may likely follow this year. So when it comes to the overall economic fortunes of the continent this year, what factors do you think will influence the prospects in Nigeria, in South Africa, and Egypt in terms of how things play out for their economies?
Well, I haven't been to Egypt for a few years since before COVID, but certainly South Africa. I was there 2 months ago, and very difficult situation. I mean, you had the story about Eskom and the power cuts, the worst ever power cuts. So you have what is supposed to be the only industrialized economy in Sub-Saharan Africa, and yet it can't deliver power. I know when I was there, people I spent time with, business people in the private and public sector, said it's just becoming impossible on that. So in a way, I mean, we talk about all these external factors that hit the countries from outside the continent, but a lot of the difficulties that we have are homegrown. In the case of South Africa, they've had all the challenges over the years, the state capture during Zuma, the capture of Eskom, the deterioration of what was really their most successful public agency, public company at that point. And again, because they've neglected this for more than a decade, it's now really coming back to haunt them. I mean, the president had to cancel his trip to WEF because it's so severe there. So I don't think we're going to see any help out of South Africa for lifting the entire continent. As you say, it's very important for Sub-Saharan Africa, for the two biggest economies, to be firing at all cylinders. If we come to Nigeria, again, people sometimes ask me about the impact of global events on Nigeria, the COVID, Ukraine invasion. But the reality is they may have some impact. But to be honest, our challenges are ones that are totally self-inflicted. We continue to have the foreign subsidy, which is consuming the largest part of the budget, more than education and health, which is extraordinary. We continue to have a currency system that essentially encourages corruption and round tripping, deprive states of much needed revenue to pay their people. And we're continue to be a very harsh environment for capital. So if you look at the power sector, people have lost huge amounts. There are companies pulling out of the country. No foreign company wants to have onshore oil assets, oil and gas assets in the country. So all of those things, contribute to the challenges that we have, and the result is that we're seeing this growth that continues to be very modest versus the population growth. So maybe we're staying even in terms of GDP per capita, but we've consistently said there's no reason we shouldn't grow 6 or 8%. The CBN governor is at 10%. I think 12% is doable given all the assets and advantages that we have. But the reason we're not doing that is nothing to do with the external environment. It's to do with things that are happening here in Nigeria.
And it's a good thing, because Nigeria was my next question for you, because there are a number of issues. The growth for the largest economy on the continent weakened to about 3.1% in 2022, just barely above the population growth rate as well. That's a conversation me and you have had over the past several conversations we've had. Persistent fuel and foreign exchange, the Naira depreciated by over 20% or around 30% last year as well. And so you see a lot of this conversation. Growth is expected to decelerate to about 2.9% in 2023. Again, just barely over the growth population rate of this economy. In all of it, as you said, not necessarily so much of the Russia, Ukraine, and external, because the issues have been here before that. Is there any way to change this story for Nigeria in 2023, particularly, again, with elections coming, a new administration, which may have new policy directions, new initiatives to bring forth? So I think instead of asking about changing the story, how much influence do you think the upcoming elections might potentially have on Nigeria's growth for this year, or even Nigeria's economic decisions and drive for the year?
Well, and I have to say, I've given all the bad news, but everyone understands the difficulties and challenges that we face, so I haven't said anything that's new. I am personally extremely optimistic about the future of Nigeria. I think many of the issues that we talk about that are challenging are fixable. In particular, the easy policy changes in the foil subsidy and in the exchange rate, both of which are essentially forms of corruption. They don't benefit anyone in the bottom of the pyramid in this nation. And I think you see a lot of political will for this to happen. So you may start to see that. There's been, I think, a great positive over the country in the last 7 or 8 years, which is you've seen more and more state governors step up to take responsibility for the development, social and economic development of their states. I'll cite His Excellency Governor Obaseki in Edo, who's done a fantastic job, has a very clear strategy, has been executing it in agriculture, in ICT, in the cultural industries. There's 3 examples of that. Other governors are starting to do a similar thing. And I think that as we come into 2023 and we get a new administration at the federal level, again, I think there's going to be a continued push to have more things happen at the state level. Real estate has to happen at the state level. Mining is really driven at the state level. Power, I've consistently said that power should be a state level matter. And I think the momentum is there, given what we need in this country for that to happen. So I think if we have a few of the major structural changes, and then we continue to have the states taking more responsibility for their economic and social strategies, I think we could very quickly turn around. And also, I also need to add, we wrote the paper about the power of the diaspora, the economic power. We were the ones that said Nigeria's biggest export is not oil, it's Nigerian grains. It continues to be true. Since we wrote that paper just before COVID, in that 2019, the impact of the diaspora is just getting more and more powerful on that. I see it every day in a positive sense. They're influencing the economy, they're influencing politics, and I think that's just a major force that's time has come. So that also makes me kind of optimistic for the future. And the other reason I'm optimistic is, to be quite frank, the existing system that we have can't continue. The foil subsidy cannot continue. It's consuming a nation. The FX regime cannot continue. The inability to invest capital properly in this country cannot continue. So all of those things are well understood, and I think there's going to be real change. But I do need to add, though, out of all of this, people ask me what's the most important issue in the economy. The most important issue at the end of the day is insecurity. You go back to this food inflation. We should be producing an enormous amount of food in this country. There's been a lot of focus on agriculture over the last more than a decade. Real credit to the CBN, who were the ones that really started to do things about it back in 2010, 2011, and now we see the momentum. So why are we still having food inflation? Food should be plentiful, it should be cheap, we should be exporting it. But a large challenge remains the insecurity. And until we solve the insecurity problem, we're not going to be able to address our other issues around food security, around inflation, around youth unemployment, because it just permeates every other aspect of one's life.
Okay, so I want to expand the conversation again, and let's talk about debts now. So we've seen global capital flow out of the continent this year, with many countries facing a multi-year period of slow growth driven by heavy debt burdens and weak investments. Government debt surpassed 60% of GDP in almost half of Sub-Saharan Africa's economies last year, and West Africa's second largest economy and a one-time shining light, Ghana, had to go back to the IMF for a record 17th time. Kenya recently received a loan from the IMF. Egypt, too, has reached a deal with the IMF. Tunisia is in talks with the IMF. Do you think we should expect more African countries that will require loans and bailouts this year just to hold on to some semblance of stability for their economies? In particularly, what does 2023 hold for Africa's debt? That's such a large conversation. I had multiple conversations about this last year. I'm going to have a specific conversation after I speak to you about Ghana's debt as well. But in terms of the debt that the continent holds right now, how is it going to weigh or impact us in 2023?
Well, there were warnings about this as we went through 2016, 17, 18, 19. I hadn't talked so much about it during the COVID era, but now it's come back because, of course, these debts were incurred at low interest rates at the time. These debts were incurred to build infrastructure projects. There were projections made about how that infrastructure project would impact the GDP and hence the taxation power of the government. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, the projects may have been completed, but we're not getting the benefits from it. So there was an overestimate of the benefit of this. And I think there's actually a rethinking. You start to see some literature from the World Bank, for example, around maybe we've been talking too much about infrastructure and over-investing. And of course, it's made more complex in the African context because in many cases, the infrastructure project was done by a Chinese state-owned company, and the money was supplied by the Chinese. And the Chinese don't have much experience in debt forgiveness, like the Paris Club back in 2007. So I think many countries are in a difficult position that way. We cite the example of Ghana. I was on the phone with my colleagues this morning, and Ghana, very, very difficult, and it's been a poster child for Africa, for improved governance, for improved health, HDI, Human Development Index movement, and they have been doing very well. But as you said, this is now the 17th time that the IMF is being called in, so it's a real challenge. And I wouldn't be surprised to see more countries have to call in the IMF on that. I hope we're not among them. I mean, even despite all the challenges we have, our debt to GDP remains very low. And unlike a lot of countries, we are an extremely wealthy country in the sense we have an enormous amount of assets. I mean, obviously the oil and gas assets are well understood. We really understand the value of gas now. But we have lots of advantages in this country that other countries don't have, and we still have a lower debt. So hopefully we'll turn our own situation around in Nigeria. The continent as a whole is really struggling. And I would like a little bit of a rethink. I mean, as I said, because of the availability of very cheap financing and very low interest rates, caused again by that reaction to the great financial crisis in 2008, and the Chinese wanting to both sell the project and then provide the financing. I mean, we found ourselves in this difficult situation. So I think there needs to be a real rethink about these large-scale capital projects that often don't deliver the benefits, but then you're left with the debt still at the end of the day.
So my next question looks at, of course, the prospects that we have. And I say that in terms of following the trend around fiscal and monetary policy tightening. While the large economies, the ones that we tend to pay a lot of attention to, are barely scraping around 5% for real GDP growth expected for 2023, you're seeing some people who are going at about 8%, 6%, 7%. Some of these smaller economies are going to end up doing much better. So it brings me back to what my question is. Was there anybody you saw that was successful in taming inflation in terms of using what we've seen so many central banks around the world use? And that's, of course, fiscal and monetary tools, increasing interest rates to be able to dampen down inflation in 2022. And do you think we should continue to expect more of this fiscal and monetary policy tightening this year, particularly even in the first to second quarters of the year?
Well, on a global scale in the advanced economies, I mean, you're going to continue to see the tightening. And of course, one of the ramifications of it, if people have followed it closely, has been a big drop in asset value. So obviously, when interest rates rise, your bond values go down, but also your equity value goes down. So you had NASDAQ closed down, I think, about 30% last year. You've seen massive loss of value in companies like Tesla, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, et cetera. And of course, that's throughout the developed nations. So I mean, most people, I remember well, in fact, the inflation back in the late 70s, early 80s, interest rates in Canada, mortgage rates hit 19%, which was extraordinary, and many people lost their house. So the central bankers who are old enough to remember that really worry about inflation. It's very, inflation is really insidious. It harms the bottom of the pyramid the most, creates all sorts of distortions in the economy. So I think the central banks around the world are committed to bringing out inflation, but by definition, particularly when we've had such monetary excess over the 15 years since the great financial crisis, to bring that out really requires some major movements. And there's some people, for example, that say the United States isn't going to move interest rates much more. I think they'll move at least 200 or 300 basis points this year. We'll continue to have real pressure on asset values, and it will continue to reverberate around the problems, as you say, in Sub-Saharan African countries that are indebted in U.S. dollars. But the central banks are committed to it. But the cost to it, we know the cost to it. You destroy aggregate demand by raising the interest rates. You're seeing it. I mean, you had this huge housing bubble in the UK. People are projecting housing prices to drop by 8%. Well, if they drop by 8% and you've had 10% inflation, 12% inflation, effectively the value of your house has dropped by 20%, which is a massive move. But there's no choice. These pressures were built up, as I said, over these 15 years. These excesses were not ever dealt with. Now they're being dealt with.
So I've asked you this before because I remember we spoke about COVID in terms of lessons, and you sort of hinted at this answering the very first questions in terms of what the structural reforms were, how the warnings have come in. 15 years ago, Africa saw certain things happen that Africa should be preparing for. But we've talked about this with COVID. What were the lessons? We're here again. The Russia-Ukraine war has shown a dependency for us, particularly on food imports, wheat imports in particular for many African countries. We're seeing this external inflation that's being imported and affecting our economies as well. We're seeing how so dependent we are for many of our economies on external factors. What, again, are the lessons now for the African economies? If 2023 is the year that we start turning the corner in terms of lessening our dependence on the West, on those outside, what do we learn? What are we learning from how difficult 2022 was for our people? Because we also have the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. It should be about 2.5, 3 years old now, but it's still going to take, it was said, about a decade, if not more, for us to see the full implementation of that or the full positives. But does that not mean we need to speed things up? What are we learning from this situation that Africa's economies are finding itself?
Well, actually, I need to start by saying the one thing we haven't talked about on this program is, of course, the demographic revolution. So outside of Africa, the working age population is declining. Outside of Africa, the number of children is declining. In Europe, those numbers are dramatic, the aging of the population. And what we're starting to see is the recognition that Europe and the Middle East, for example, need African young people to work. So I was in Qatar. I had the privilege of going to Qatar for the World Cup. And I saw two games with Senegal and one game with Morocco, so good African representation. Very exciting to watch both of them play. But the one thing that really struck me in Qatar that was different than a decade ago is that there are lots of jobs are now being done by young Africans. And of course, some of the jobs are at the lower end of the job pyramid, but some of them were very senior, and they need Africans. Those are the people who are actually going to do the work for the world. So in one sense, a phrase that I used more than a decade ago is Europe needs Africa more than Africa needs Europe. And it's really becoming true because of the demographic shift on that. I mean, you look at the pressure, for example, trying to hire care workers from Nigeria now to work in the United Kingdom with an aging population, and the pressure on the NHS in terms of staffing, as an example. So I think that we have a huge amount to offer the world from Sub-Saharan Africa. We are a big part of the world's progress over the next few decades. In terms of our own vulnerabilities, I think that what you've said is exactly right, particularly on the food security. If there's one lesson that we should have learned out of COVID and out of the low interest rate environment turning to a high interest rate environment and out of the Ukrainian invasion, it's that food security is important, and food security is a local matter. I mean, if something disastrous happens, older people may remember there was this, in the 2000s, early 2003, 4, 5, around then, you had people from China, people from UAE buying agricultural land in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, for the purpose of food security. But of course, that's just absolute nonsense, because if there really is a food crisis, no one's going to ship the food out of the country. They're going to use it internally. And that's where we should be heading here. I mean, it's just a scandal that we are importing food in Nigeria. When I looking out at Abuja, how fertile it is here, Plateau State can grow everything on here. I mean, the quality of the products that we get in Abuja is just fantastic. And there's absolutely no reason that we shouldn't be, we coined the term world food superpower about a decade ago. That's where we should be heading on that. But if there's one lesson we should take out of these two crises over the last few years, it's that agricultural security has to come. But in addition to that, I don't think we should go down the path of saying we have to produce everything ourselves. We're still going to have global trade. But AFCFTA is really critical, and I did a session with a group of young Nigerians on Saturday about AFCFTA. Incredible opportunities, but not just around the export of physical goods, because that's quite difficult, it continues to be difficult in our environment. But it's the export of services, Nollywood, ICT services, music services, financial services. So that's really booming, and I think creates a lot of opportunities for young people to be able to sell what they can do into other African countries. So we need that. On that. So I'm really optimistic. AFCFTA has shown a lot of political will. As you said, it's a long-term project that was actually conceived of in 2013 as part of the Africa Union's 50-year plan. So people recognize it takes a long time. We're a few years into it. We're starting to slowly gather momentum, but I expect about 3 years from now, so 5 years into it, that we'll really start to be getting some momentum about AFCFTA. I think the other thing, though, I know to go on about intra-Africa trade, of course, is a lot more of it happens than we say officially. So there's this narrative there's no intra-Africa trade, but in fact, there's a huge amount of informal trade between countries through the land. I mean, for example, between Nigeria and Niger and Mali, Burkina Faso, of course, Togo, Benin, Ghana, and that doesn't always get recorded. So in fact, the African economies are more integrated than we think.
All right, Andrew, before I let you go, give me your top three. You don't like making projections, so let me change it to trends. Maybe your top three economic trends that you think we should keep an eye out for when it comes to African economies in 2023, very briefly.
Number one trend that's really critical, and we just wrote the paper on this, is the export of high value added services. So I said before, the diaspora, the export of grains from Nigeria. Grains are our biggest export, not oil. But the thing now is, because so much work can be done remotely, in integrated ways, the ability for people to stay in Nigeria and export those services is fantastic. So they can stay in their communities, earn dollars in their communities, spend in their communities, selling their brain power, exporting grains, but without leaving Nigeria. That's the number one trend that I'd like to stress. The number two trend that we need here in Nigeria is these distortionary subsidies, which are really forms of corruption. So the two big ones being foil and the FX regime have to go. I mean, if we're going to make progress, they've been holding us back for a very long time. It's really come to a crisis point on that. And I think the third trend is something I'm going to call, for Nigerian perspective, global Nigeria. So we're talking about the diaspora. What we're now really seeing is Nigeria is not a single physical place. It's actually a global Nigeria. The diaspora has become so powerful. It's integrated with Nigeria, but it extends all over the planet. So that's the three trends that I would put on. More Nigeria focused than for Africa, as you said.
That's fine.
A lot of the challenges for Africa, and I really hope South Africa can sort out its issues so that they can help pull the continent forward.
And we'll take it like that. A lot of pressure also on Nigeria, South Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa this year, but we'll be keeping an eye on how those things play out. And also talking to you about some of these papers about the exports of high-value brains and things like that, and what that means for the African continent. But Andrew, that will be another time. Thank you so much for your time today.
You're very welcome. Have a great day.
You too.